Our first speaker is Francis Carpinelli of Benedictine College, Arkansas, Kansas. He has essentially published on Thomas More for more than 34 years, if I counted well, from 1977 to 200.
Now, if you happen to have read the abstract, and I'm not assuming you did, you know that it says utopian communities are islands or walled-in cities which relegate various polluting activities to outside their boundaries. The present essay explores this thesis in Thomas More's Utopia, specifically concerning imprisonment and execution of criminals, keep that in mind as one, sequestering of the sick, especially in lepers, keep that in mind as number two, and the butchering of animals. So we have three different kinds of pollutions which are outside the walls. And these key pollutions stood out for More in the London of his own day as he traveled to Oxford. Now remember, in approximately 1492 to 94, when he was about 14 to 16 years old, he went back and forth to Oxford from London. And we're going to see that on a map in just a minute or two. He walked either through or past these places. Past the condemned criminals at Newgate Prison, which was built into the London Wall on the west side, so we had to go through there. And the butchering of animals at Smithfield Market. Now actually they had a very large market inside the city wall, but they were supposed to, the animals were supposed to have already been butchered. They had big arguments with the butchers over this because the butchers wanted to do it inside and city officials wanted them to do it outside. And then further along the Holborn-Oxford Road, which goes west and then north to Oxford, past the leper colony, hospital at St. Giles, and the notorious public execution area at Tyburn. Now, there were execution places at other places around London, but the most notorious and the most common one was from Newgate to Tyburn, and that was a distance of 2.5 to 3 miles or so. The young Thomas More would see these three types of pollution as he was going back and forth to Oxford. And we'll see how they play out in Utopia itself. So to some extent, this paper is about geography, but it's about several other things that by the time we get to the end, you'll find out, oh, how many questions is he raising here? So we'll be talking not only about geography, but we'll be talking about the Latin text of Utopia, and one particular word and concept in particular, clemencia, mercy. And we'll see how that and associated words are included in Utopia. And then the opposite, the words for cruelty and inhumanity and so on. We'll also be talking about why is there so much emphasis on this butchering of animals in Utopia, and also hunting. These were, as far as utopians were concerned, these were deplorable activities, in addition to war, of course. So we'll be talking about that. We'll be talking about the St. Thomas More as a potential follower of St. Francis of Assisi, particularly on this idea of mercy and communion with all God's creation. And we will end up with some discussion of extremism and the symbolic meaning of walls. What do you keep in? What do you keep out? Okay? So let's turn then to the first sheet and the one side which says three key pollutants in Thomas More's London. You should have that in front of you. Now, if you didn't get a copy, did you? Okay. So at the top it says in roughly 1490 to 92, the young teenager More traveled back and forth to Oxford. from his home in Milk Street in northwest London. If you look at the map at the bottom on the right-hand side, you'll find Milk Street with a little asterisk right below London Wall. Everybody see that? Okay. He had a very short walk to get what was called West Cheap or Cheapside, a block or two. And then just a few hundred yards before he got to the west side of the London Wall. But before he got there, he went through an area called the Shambles. The Shambles is where they had the butchers. Now, theoretically, the butchers were supposed to kill their horses and cows outside the city, where you see West Smithfield. You see that as 1A, right above the wall. And then you see Shambles as 1B. Okay, so then you get through the London Wall, Newgate, as number 2A here. And then you are, as you're progressing along the Holborn Road, you cross the Fleet River, which we were referring to earlier. The butchers were supposed to dump their offal, their debris, into the river, one form of pollution. And they also, some people also had seines or nets to catch fish. And there were always disputes going on about who was polluting the river and who was not polluting the river. And you work your way past Lincoln's Inn, which is where Thomas More's father was a member, and Thomas More himself eventually became a member. And you go along the Holborn Road, and you pass St. Giles in the Fields, which is listed as number 3. That's where a leper hospital was. All the way out to the left is what's called Tyburn, and this was a place of execution, public execution. For centuries in London, in England, they had public executions which were almost like fair days. Days when people had off, apprentices would go out there, and all sorts of people were drinking and shouting and screaming, and they wanted to see this public execution. And many, many people, maybe 20 at a time, would be hanged. And that was for the common criminals. If you were a traitor, you not only got hanged, you got hanged, drawn, and quartered. So not only did they hang you, but they would cut you down before you were quite dead. They would slit you open, tear out your heart, cut off your testicles, maybe stuff them in your mouth. This all sounds good, doesn't it? Right in for lunch. And then they would, after totally killing you, they would divide you into 4 quarters. One of those quarters for the Carthusian monk, Father John Houghton, was nailed to the door of the Carthusian monastery as a warning to the rest of the Carthusians. Pretty ugly, huh? So these are the kinds of atrocities or kinds of problems that Thomas More would see. I mean, he would see these things. So just to very roughly go through, butchering is 1A, slaughtering of animals in West Smithfield, outside the wall, and the offal thrown into the Fleet River. 1B is butchering and marketing of carcasses in the Shambles. Under imprisonment and execution of prisoners, you see thieves and other criminals held at Newgate Prison. Some people actually got out, but a very large portion of them knew that they were going to be executed. And they were being executed for very minor kinds of thievery, mainly, as is mentioned in Utopia. So 2B, before huge raucous crowds, prisoners processed by carts and hurdles to Tyburn for execution. They would stop at the Holy Sepulchre Church, which is not on this map. It's right outside Newgate, and to St. Giles, where they would get little posies or flower arrangements and drinks. You know, I mean, this is almost like celebration, but we know it was execution. And I have listed last here the quarantining of lepers at St. Giles in the Fields. They were barred. The lepers were barred. This wasn't the only leper church, but this was one of the ones that Thomas More walked past. So, what's going to happen then once we turn to utopia itself. So if you look on the back of the first sheet that you have, there, where it says 3 key pollutants in Thomas More's Utopia under butchering of animals, these are all quotes from the Yale edition of More's Utopia. Outside the city are designated places where all gore and offal may be washed away by running water. Back to water again. They transport the carcasses slaughtered and cleaned by the hands of slaves. They do not allow their citizens to accustom themselves to the butchering of animals, by the practice of which they think that mercy, the finest feeling of our human nature, is gradually killed off. I think this is an extremely powerful statement. Mercy, the finest feeling of our human nature, is gradually killed off. The word for mercy in Utopia most of the time is clemencia, not misericordia, which always puzzles me because in the Bible there's many more references to misericordia than clemencia, but More chooses clemencia here. Then on pages 234, 35, utopians slay no animals for religious sacrifices. Another quote here. You do not believe that the divine clemency, and we're going to get clemencia once again here, delights in bloodshed and slaughter, seeing that it has imparted life to animate creatures that they might enjoy life. So this is a regard for all God's creatures, not just humans. There's a very strong emphasis on butchering and also on hunting in More's Utopia. On execution of thieves, Hythloday talks about visiting England in the late 1490s when there were mass and public executions of thieves. He argues against taking a man's life because he has taken someone else's property. He appeals first to the law of Moses and then to the new law of mercy. Look at the word again, clemencia. You know, it's kind of like there's a pattern here. If you are reading your Latin, please, I think that's what we desperately need. We need this very close reading of key Latin terms in Utopia. So this is the new law of the New Testament. But there are no comments on prisons and public executions in Utopia. It's very peculiar. The prisoners are marked off by their clothing and by their, I think they've clipped ears. But there's one reference that I found to some prisoners being held overnight. But outside of that, as far as I know, there are no prisons in Utopia. Somebody else might notice, but I don't think so. And there are very few limited bases for capital punishment in Utopia. Of course, it's a perfect, it's supposed to be an ideal commonwealth. So if More is going to be critical of what's going on in his own time, in his own place, he only takes up public executions of humans when Hythloday talks about that. It's not in Utopia. It's in the work Utopia, but it's not in the land of Utopia. Okay? So there's this important distinction here. So, okay. So we're working our way towards this theme of clemencia, of mercy. For treatment of the sick, especially those with contagious diseases, this is what More says. Special care is first taken of the sick, looked after in public hospitals. There are 4 at the city limits, a little outside the walls, of course. These are roomy, that the sick should not be packed too close together, and that those who have a contagious disease may be isolated. The hospitals are very well furnished. Such tender and careful treatment and such constant attendance of expert physicians. Now, we don't actually get the word clemencia here. I was disappointed. I wanted clemencia to be in this description, but it didn't go. But there are associated, as we're going to see on the second page, there are associated terms that have to do with compassion and positive and loving treatment. Then a little later in Utopia, Hythloday says, the sick, as I said, are very lovingly cared for. They console the incurably diseased by sitting and conversing with them and by applying all possible alleviations. So that would be a form of mercy. And By the way, it just happens to be, pardon me, one of our corporal works of mercy. Then at the very bottom of this first sheet, and originally I thought I was just going to give you one sheet, so I very quickly summarized this. Contrasting with mercy, tenderness, and compassion, see references to cruelty, inhumanity, and beastliness, especially on the topics of hunting, standing armies, mercenaries, Zapolites, and war. For example, hunting to the Utopians is a false pleasure wholly assigned to their butchers. The extremely avaricious Zapolites are hunters and mercenaries born for warfare, and war itself is an activity fit only for beasts and yet practiced by no kind of beast so constantly as by man, and utterly loathed, abominantur, by the Utopians. Okay, so that's the end of my comments on the first sheet you got. So unless you want to interrupt, we're going to go right onto your second sheet, all right? Okay. Let us look on the side which says mercy for all God's creatures or dominion over them. Now, a footnote in the Utopia, the Yale Utopia, on page 475, references various passages noting that one of the main purposes of Utopia is the conversion of the capital sentence to penal servitude. They would rather that they be slaves. Even beyond this specific purpose are the aims spelled out by Father Sertz in his introduction to this volume. Moore intends his works for the advocates of change and reform, for the defenders of social and distributive justice, for the protagonists of mercy and charity, which is what I'm emphasizing, for the partisans of international peace, and for the apostles of the pure gospel of Christ. Now, let me stop for just a minute and give this man who came in a couple of handouts so that he's not totally confused. Thank you. All right. Now, secondly on this sheet, we have Moore's terms indicating compassion on the left-hand column and cruelty on the right-hand column. So if you were going to do a detailed analysis of the vocabulary and the concepts from the vocabulary, you would be looking at terms like this, and this is not an absolutely exhaustive list. But you see the emphasis on mercy, humanity, kindness, leniency, as opposed to cruelty, beastliness, inhumanity, and so on. I list the 7 corporal works of mercy, which I'm sure you know already. And the first 4 of them are taken care of immediately once you go into a socialistic utopia. Feed the hungry, drink to the thirsty, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless. That's all automatic. There's nobody poor in utopia. So the benefits come naturally. None of the people, no one is poor. But the remaining 3 are as follows. Visit the sick. We just saw that, didn't we? Visit the imprisoned. Well, they don't have any imprisoned in utopia. And bury the dead. Now, there's an interesting little comment on bury the dead. Note the passage on how, this is a quote once again, they regret the death of no one but him whom they see torn from life anxiously and unwillingly and is reluctantly drawn against his will. Such persons they carry out to burial in memorial in melancholy silence, and after praying God to be merciful, our magic word comes up again, clemencia. Or here it's a different form, but clementer. To their shades and graciously to pardon their infirmities, they cover the corpse with earth. Now, I wanted to get on to another possible theme or pattern we should be looking at, and that is, what happens with Genesis when God says, okay, I've created all these things, now I've created man, and I give him dominion over all other creatures. So here's the quote. Be fertile and multiply, fill the earth and subdue, that's an interesting word, subdue it, have dominion over the fish, birds, and all the living things that move on the earth. Just how far does dominion extend? Because that means you can kill animals. Well, Moore was not opposed to killing of animals. He understood, but he certainly didn't like the butchering that he saw, and he wanted it to be outside the walls. But what about butchering of human beings? So let's see on the other back page. We're on the back of our 2-page handout. Dominion, walls, and extremism. Now, these are quotes from Dominic Baker Smith's More's Utopia, a very interesting book. And he's talking about Franciscanism, and also, well, here the Latin term is dominium. It's not quite the same as what we would say as dominion. But he's talking about ownership. And he says landlords, domini, we have the Latin word domus for house, domini for lord. We're talking about property, but we're also talking about possession over and control over. So he says landlords have dominium or property rights, while the utopians, like Platonic citizens or radical Franciscans, eschew such divisive claims. And then another quote from him. Once again, we can see why More should picture himself as the prince of the utopians dressed in a Franciscan habit. The Franciscan radicals had aspired to apostolic poverty, understood as a primitive condition of possessio, or use, which was based on natural needs and which broke away from the system of dominium or property rights imposed by civil society. Now, I have a note here. We can extend the concept of dominium beyond property rights to society's control over and killing of animals and maybe even human beings. Now, there's a brief discussion of this matter in a book by Robert P. Adams called The Better Part of Valor. It's a very interesting discussion, but he is primarily interested in trying to follow the thought of John Colet, Erasmus, Thomas More, and Vives on tyranny and the role of the ruler in relation to the populace. And he very briefly does mention mercy as a very, very strong and important concept, but he breezes through it in about 1 or 2 pages. I mean, he's got a 350-page book, which is very interesting, very detailed. And he notices this point about mercy, but he's primarily interested in tyranny. And Dominic Baker Smith is primarily interested in property. So I'm trying to get over to a Franciscan concept, a biblical concept. So that's what St. Francis wanted to do. He wanted to follow Jesus. He wanted to fill his ideals. That's where I want to go. So quotes from St. Thomas of Assisi and his first biographer, Celano, on the universal kinship of all God's creatures. He says the following: even for worms, he, St. Francis, had a warm love. In the winter, well, let's stop there for just a minute. Thomas, if St. Francis came along and he saw worms on the road, he would stop, he would pick them up and put them on the side where they wouldn't get stepped on, because he didn't want any kind of destruction of God's creatures. And for bees, he had his fellow Franciscans put out honey or even wine so the bees would not perish from the cold. Now, is that extremism? I don't know. You have to answer the question. Now, who are the extremists here? Am I getting...
Yeah, over time.
Okay. So, the last 2 little notes here, and we can discuss them if you wish, is whether or not Thomas More ended up as a third-order Franciscan. And any literary person would think of the walls as having symbolic meaning. What do you keep in? What do you keep out? Is it physical? Is it spiritual? Is it ethical? And we can talk about those as well. So we have a whole bunch of topics we can talk about. Thank you very much.